So while there are, of course, many different targets or motives or reasons why we've seen such sustained protests on the streets of Britain over the past 2 months, I want to touch on maybe a handful of the different reasons why it is I think people have been taken to the streets. So, of course, the primary impetus was the killing of George Floyd, which I don't need to go into any more detail to, I'm sure. I think it only bears repeating that George Floyd wasn't simply murdered. He was tortured to death over nearly 9 minutes in what I think is best described as the most public lynching in human history. But of course, the reasons that I think people took to the streets in Britain in their tens, if not hundreds of thousands, I think is linked to a number of other critical factors. I think, of course, one of them are the links to contemporary forms of police racism here on the British mainland. You saw the names of people being chanted, of people who have been killed by the police here in Britain by many of the protesters themselves. But of course, it wasn't just the kind of multicultural big cities like Bristol or Liverpool or Manchester or Birmingham or London where you saw significant protest action. You saw small towns and villages in relatively rural areas of England, Wales and Scotland also mobilise anti-racist actions, for some of them for the first time in their history. And I think that speaks to something else. It doesn't speak to necessarily a resistance to policing, even if they're able to see the police violence on their TV screens or on their computers or mobile phones. I think it also speaks to a resistance to a rise of nationalism, a rise of nationalist politics, of patriotic politics, which has been symbolised by the Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings administration, symbolised by Trump, and of course symbolised by the current Conservative government's 3-word manifesto, Get Brexit Done. And so I think there's a confluence of factors which have led to this massive anti-racist mobilisation. On the one hand, a reckoning with state racism brought about not just by policing, but also the disproportionate deaths at the hands of COVID-19 for Black and Asian and minority ethnic people in this country, the treatment of NHS workers, which of course Black and Asian people are disproportionately there as frontline workers, the lack of support for other frontline workers, whether it be people driving taxis or people working in the service sector and things like that, but also I think a kind of a resistance from many white people, I think, who recognise that they are the target constituency of this white nationalism, of this ultra-nationalism of the Johnson-Cummings administration. And I think there's a rejection of that as well, which is, I think has led to so many relatively small towns and villages mobilising in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter protests in a way that I don't think this country's ever seen before. So, of course, one of the most poignant links to anti-colonialism that we've seen in the last few weeks have been the targeting of Britain's colonial monuments. Of course, the press has sought to individualise these movements very recently. So, you know, they've been asking, was Churchill a racist? Well, or was, you know, Colston really a racist? But of course, the question isn't, were these individual people racist? The question I think really is, did these people engage in colonial slavery and imperialism? And do they therefore come to represent colonialism and imperialism today, right? And I think that the answers to those questions are unequivocal. And so I think that there's a very powerful moment here in which young people, you know, particularly the people who organise these protests overwhelmingly in their teens or early 20s, have made that very, very explicit link between colonialism and imperialism and racism. And I think this is fundamentally important because Britain, of course, likes to tell itself that racism is this thing that, you know, started happening to Britain after the Windrush generation, and forcing Britain to recognise that racism is far older than post-war migration from its former colonies to the British mainland has been a fundamentally important part of the argument of anti-racists, and I think it's been brought to life through the targeting of these colonial and imperial monuments even if it's something that the British government and press have wanted to dwell on far more than the more material demands relating to the criminal justice system, health, housing, and other demands. I think I'm going to say a little bit about Black Lives Matter and their relationship with, I guess, less so Kashmir, but I think it's been more explicit in relation to Palestine. So for decades, the Black struggle has been in solidarity with the Palestinian people, particularly since the 1967 war and the emergence of the slogan Black Power, as coined by Stokely Carmichael, but then spreading across the Caribbean and much of the African continent as well. And it's in this moments that you see solidarity really becoming being concretized between the Black Power movement and the movement for Palestinian liberation. And so and of course, we're seeing that continued with both the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, sending delegations to Palestine, and of course the recent, I really hate this word, controversy, which rose from a Black Lives Matter tweet in solidarity with the Palestinian people following the proposal to annex parts of the West Bank, being accused of anti-Semitism and other things like that. I think what that one demonstrates is the ways in which the solidarity of Black movements with anti-imperial movements like that in Palestine are not just fundamentally important because those struggles are connected, but are also very, very dangerous to the interests at stake who benefit from the racist projects both in Israel, Palestine, as well as those in Europe and the United States. But I want to end by arguing that basis for improvement Black Lives Matter movement. Particularly the 1980s and the onset of neoliberalization, we've seen the attempt by the state to co-opt and individualize racism, to reduce racism to something which is the problem of individuals. And we really can't let neoliberalism reduce racism to the problem of individuals, because what that ends up doing is it reduces racism to the problem of unconscious bias, to the problem of a lack of diversity or a lack of Black leadership in key specific positions in powerful institutions. Or it creates the impression that there are limited resource communities need to battle and compete with each other over these limited state resources, which then leads to people deciding that some racialized groups are more or less privileged than other racialized groups, and therefore are not deserving of resources or solidarity, and therefore should be, and solidarity in these kinds of movements should be reduced to individualized allyship. Where people self-reflect on their own behaviour, which of course is important, but isn't going to defeat racism if it is separated from the material struggles of solidarity against racial capitalism and imperialism. And so by better understanding the roots of British racism as being not simply something which began on the British mainland when British people came to when people from Britain's colonies came to Britain in significant numbers, but in fact understanding British anti-racism as being something that is rooted in anti-colonialism against the British states, whether it be the uprisings in Trinidad in the 1930s or in Ghana in the 1950s, or the anti-apartheid movements in South Africa and Rhodesia, or the anti-colonial struggles across the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. If we understand the roots of British anti-racism as being fundamentally linked to the histories of anti-colonialism, not only can we strengthen the struggles in solidarity with anti-imperial movements today, but we can also resist the essentializing and individualizing tendencies in which the state and capital have used to attempt to co-opt anti-racist movements against its anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and fundamentally solidarity-focused impulses that make it as strong and important as it is. And I'll leave it there.